Good afternoon. I am so delighted to be here today. Thank you to Jean, thank you to Stephanie for having me. I'm so grateful to be in conversation with my fellow panelists on this larger community. I've been researching Zilia Sanchez's career since 2016, and I'm currently writing my dissertation on her career. So what I will be presenting today is it's an abridged version of a dissertation chapter that I wrote. I have quite a bit of material on this subject, which I've had to pare down a little bit. So I hope that the clarity and the insights remain, even though this is a shortened version of a chapter that I've written. My talk is titled Poetic Currents of the Body in and as the Cosmos. Displayed on a sandy beach along the water's edge, with gently cresting waves and a cloudless blue sky stretching into the distance, Sanchez's Lunar Dos graces the catalog cover of the artist's 3-decade retrospective held in Puerto Rico in 1991. Unlike the frequently modular, rectilinear, and wall-mounted topologies that Sanchez began making in 1960s New York, Lunar Dos is a single rounded, freestanding canvas that was photographed outdoors in the Caribbean. Positioned on a sculptural base, it is composed entirely of circles, from its tondo format to its nested interior of a painted gray circle containing 2 swollen orbs. Both visually and conceptually, this artwork represents the launching of a new phase in Sanchez's career, her conflation of the body with the moon that began shortly after she relocated from New York City, where she had lived throughout the 1960s, to San Juan, Puerto Rico in 1971. Drawing on the linguistic duality of the word lunar, which in Spanish is both an adjective relating to the moon and a noun referring to a mole or birthmark on the skin, Lunar Dos locates the female anatomy in and metaphorically as the celestial contours of the moon. The work's circumference, for example, may be read as a single breast, a full moon, or a mole, while its inner motif suggests a painted areola with projecting nipples or a pair of cosmic beings in orbit. Its spare compositional symmetry conveys a harmonious balance between the female body and the universe, an equilibrium that is further evoked in the photograph of Lunar Dos displayed along the shoreline. In this image, Sanchez underscores the primordial rhythmic alignment of the female cycle, the moon, and the tides. She depicts her topological body not only in and as nature, but also seemingly at home in the Caribbean landscape, at once connecting the timing of her lunar series with her own regional homecoming in the early 1970s. Here in Puerto Rico, writes Margarita Fernandez Zavala in the artist's 1991 catalog, Sanchez composed lunar supports for her modular reliefs, because according to Sanchez herself, in New York, there was no moon. Indeed, in the metropolis where Sanchez spent her first decade in exile, one's view of the moon was often obscured by towering buildings, hazy skies, and a canopy of artificial lights. It was also a profoundly bleak and difficult period for the artist as she navigated an uncertain future abroad. The moon, which she had previously associated with comforting memories of her Cuban childhood and her youthful travels abroad, had lost its luster in New York. The absence of the moon in this period, followed by its resurfacing in Puerto Rico, would inspire Sanchez to construct across several decades many lunares of varying forms, hues, and dimensions, not just as canvas topologies, but also as aluminum, marble, and cement sculptures, several of which she sited outdoors. In addition to single tondos, some of her lunar topologies were fashioned as diptychs, essentially 2 half-circular canvases or half-moons that converged to form a full circle, while across the series she portrayed a variety of shapely anatomy, from the curves of breasts, thighs, and hips, to the closed lips of a mouth or a vulva. Despite the production of Sanchez's lunares in Puerto Rico, however, this paper contends that the artist's body-moon motif was initially nourished and deeply enmeshed in the cosmic and exilic poetics of her 1960s New York literary circles. In the magazines, poems, paintings, drawings, and criticism produced by Sanchez and her Cuban colleagues, their work is pregnant with allusions to the moon and the universe, and to the relationship between the body and nature. These themes, they argue, are not only evocative of the Cuban community's protracted exile during the 60s, but also responsive to the exploration of new utopian frontiers encouraged by the decade's space race and the world's first lunar landing in 1969. For Sanchez and her close friends, the moon doubled as a desired anchor for the transient body and as a utopian foil to the harsh realities of their alienating, unsettled years abroad. Their cosmic and corporeal writings and imagery of the 1960s and early 1970s underscored their existential and erotic search for belonging, communion, and coupling in the world, a search that visually plays out in Sanchez's emergent Lunares. Before continuing, however, I'd like to address a common discrepancy in the dating of the artist's lunar series. For example, Sanchez's beautiful Lunar con Tatuaje, which is next to me here, appears to be prematurely dated in many curatorial and scholarly projects, often identified as being constructed around 1968 or 1969, with the much later addition of a light blue circle and a sprawling black ink tattoo. This artwork is originally pictured in Sanchez's own archival files as having been produced in 1973, a period that locates this topology, as well as her larger lunar series, within her Puerto Rican practice, not her earlier 1960s New York practice. Such fluctuations and inconsistencies in the dating of Sanchez's initial topologies are quite common, as I have learned in my research over the last several years. The artist herself frequently changed the titles of some of her early shape canvases, and she did not always date her artworks as she made them. It's also important to keep in mind that Sánchez, for more than half a century, was denied the institutional support and critical attention that many canonical artists of her generation received, and which helped them to build their own record-keeping systems and robust histories. Existential poetics in Sanchez's circles. In her 1962 poem, Epítesis, the young Cuban poet Mercedes Cortázar describes the engulfing despair and solitude felt by newly arrived émigrés in New York. Her poem, of which an excerpt appears here, depicts a pair of migrant bodies adrift in a cold, concrete metropolis, where virtually everything, from one's romantic sparks and anguished cries to the reassuring presence of the moon, has been swallowed up. In Greek drama, the term epítesis refers to the dramatic arc of a play, in which the plot thickens and leads towards catastrophe. In Cortázar's poem, this concept frames the author's increasingly desperate encounters in a city devoid of the grounding comforts and familiar rhythms of nature. New York, with its sunrise of neon lights, its withered stars, and all the green having fallen from the trees, is portrayed as an oppressive, artificial environment where one's connections to both people and place have become confusingly opaque. Here, even the moon, a once reliable symbol and source of light, solace, and temporal change, has failed to track from Havana to New York. It appears newly devoured and disappeared, at once a lonely and foreboding image of Cortázar's and her colleagues' homelessness in the world. Giving visual equivalence to Cortázar's sentiments were Sanchez's figurative illustrations that she made for Protesta, the first literary magazine produced by post-revolutionary Cuban writers in exile. Spearheaded by Cortázar, Protesta, which ran as a single, slender, bilingual issue before closing, was Cortázar's response to the lack of creative outlets and publishing opportunities available to young Cuban writers. Protesta's wraparound cover, designed by Sánchez and printed in black and white, depicted a floating island irreparably split along the magazine's fold, with communication appearing alternately jumbled through tumbling type and densely obscured via concealed newsprint at opposite ends. The synonymous breakdown of language and landscape, symbolized in the form of a bifurcated island, evoked the fraying world that Sánchez and her colleagues were experiencing in the early 60s. Having fled one island, that of Cuba, for another, Manhattan, they encountered an imposed silencing of their voices in both places. Whereas in Havana, their deeply expressive writings and paintings were, by the demands of the Cuban government, to be replaced by a collective and affirmative revolutionary language, in New York, Sánchez and her friends found themselves suspect among many progressive artists and intellectuals for having abandoned what their US peers perceived was a radical social utopia. The distress felt by Cuban immigrants of belonging neither here nor there has been theorized by Cuban literary scholars as the condition of doble destierro, double banishment, or doble exilio, that is, of being and feeling twice displaced and fully isolated in the world. Sanchez's interior drawing for Protesta embodied this condition that she and her peers were experiencing. The figure's face, rendered in thick black outline, gazes directly at the viewer with cold, unblinking eyes, thin, unparted lips, and a weary sense of resignation. Across the 1960s, Sanchez's forlorn figure would reappear in various guises in several literary projects, ultimately acquiring a deeper sense of cosmic alienation. In 1962, she began working with Las Americas Publishing Company in Manhattan as a book designer. Among her projects was the book jacket for Ramon Sender's novel La Luna de los Perros, or The Dog's Moon, an existential account of the cruelty, violence, and alienation of a Spanish Civil War exile living in Paris. Sanchez's cover image, which pictures a solitary figure with a rounded lunar-like face immersed in a reddish-brown haze, captured the book's sense of crisis. Several years later, Sánchez produced an analogous otherworldly scene for the New York literary magazine La Nueva Sangre, or The New Blood, which was co-founded by a group of Cuban and Puerto Rican poets. In the magazine's March-April 1969 issue, Sánchez revived her lonesome figure from the early 60s in a full-page illustration rendered in loose, repetitive strokes. The figure's body, positioned in the cosmos, appears entwined in a tangled geometric web and set against a dark, faintly starry background resembling outer space. As with Sanchez's previous illustrations, this one, too, conveys a sense of desolation informed by the artist's personal experiences, yet translated into a more universal image. Importantly, Sanchez's circular visages share a striking resemblance to her now-lost monotype, Cara de Luna, or moon face, which conceptually links the artist's faces with the form of the moon for the first time. In Cara de Luna, the figure's rotund face, depicted with wide-open eyes, a mouth slightly agape, and a tilted posture, fills the entirety of the image. It hovers on the page, displaying a watchful, remote, and even calm presence, akin to the Earth's moon itself. There appears to be a genuine peacefulness in this lunar face, signaling a more harmonious convergence of the body and the moon. Although it's unclear whether Sánchez actually produced this print in late 1950s Cuba, as the artist's attribution suggests, or whether it belongs to her 1960s production in New York, when Sanchez's printmaking practice ostensibly began, this image gives the impression that the artist may have viewed some of her other faces in the 1960s as caras de luna as well. Infusing the corporeal and the natural world in her illustrations, Sánchez was exploring a theme that was concurrently dominating her painting practice. In the months before she fled Cuba, Sánchez had started transitioning away from the rich coloring and fluid shapes of her 1950s lyrical abstract paintings and had begun to experiment with raw materials and mixtures, such as resins, wax, and sawdust, that gave her canvases a rough, matte surface and an overall earthen appearance. Her attention to materiality and built-up surfaces reflects her encounters during a European sojourn in 1957, when she became interested in the paintings of Spanish informal artists, especially Antoni Tapies. His unorthodox use of non-artistic materials like sand and earth emphasized the transformative qualities of matter and resulted in wall-like canvases that the artist often scratched, graffitied, or gouged. By 1960, Sánchez had fully gravitated to an informalist style, showing blocky, textured passages alongside areas of raw, unprimed canvas, and mingling at times with the traces of a gridded, graffiti-like structure. These compositions signaled Sánchez's alignment with her Spanish vanguard contemporaries, whose paintings were garnering accolades across Europe and the Americas, while resonating with Sánchez emotionally in their experientially informed, yet seemingly universal vocabulary. Tapia's explosive and at times violent approach to materials evoked the trauma and destruction of the Spanish Civil War and its aftermath. Sánchez, having been immersed in her country's own political turmoil of the 1950s, identified with the Spaniards' political condition and their ensuing manipulation of matter. Moreover, she appreciated how their mode of painting enabled her to depict and enact reality, to manifest worlds crumbling, colliding, and shifting at a time when such radical, precarious changes were impacting her own life. As Sánchez remarked in 1965, quote, "In my paintings, the elemental of things stands out, since I almost unconsciously search for man confronting the universe in my themes," end quote. During her initial years in New York, Sánchez's informalist practice grew more expressive and expansive, with larger canvases, thicker and more varied passages, and titles alluding to natural and cosmological phenomena that were analogous to ideas of social transformation. In paintings titled Tierra, or Earth, Agua, Water, Desintegración, Disintegration, Cuerpos Organizados, Organized Bodies, and Microcosmos, or Microcosms, among many others, Sánchez rendered what one critic described as emotional states, the movements of consciousness, and historic processes of transformation and change. For the artist's Cuban friends, Sánchez's Informalist paintings reignited a necessary elemental connection between man and the universe. They conveyed, in the words of poet Isel Rivero, an urgent reminder that civilization must recoil to its center, to its origins, in order to recuperate the lost self. A primordial emphasis on the body and nature was a key subject of the early 1960s poetry of both Cortázar and Rivero, whose publications were illustrated with abstract artworks by Sánchez. Cortázar even wrote a trio of poems in 1963 entitled Tierra, Agua, and Fuego that were conversant with the titles of Sánchez's paintings. That same year, Rivero published her long poem, Tundra, Poema a dos voces, or Tundra, Poem in Two Voices. Her poem offered one of the clearest visions yet of Cuban pilgrimage, translated into a centuries-old tale of human migration and exile, a journey replete with both terrestrial agony and cosmic wonder. Ultimately, the tundra, a vast landscape of snow, ice, and silence, provides a sensual refuge in her poem for a single fortunate pilgrim. Yearning for a space where love and dreams are permitted, this pilgrim imagines the virginal and vaginal-like opening of the tundra and the orgasmic display of its northern lights. Upon his arrival, he finds himself immersed in a deep silence. It was the silence, writes Rivero, that elevated his peace and the devastation. Rivero's envisioning of a corporeal cosmic embrace of the exiled body coupling with a remote, refulgent terrain would parallel aspects of Sánchez's conflation of the human face and eventually the female body with the moon, in the same decade when the corporeal and the cosmic were literally about to meet. So this section is titled Space Age Encounters and Spatial Eroticism. On July 21, 1969, the New York Times published photographs of the previous day's triumphant lunar landing by Apollo 11's astronauts, who were the first humans to ever walk on the surface of the Earth's moon. This cosmic landscape, not dissimilar to Rivero's remote, depopulated tundra, had long functioned as a space of human mystery, desire, and projection. Photos of the lunar landing showed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin Jr. bounding across the pockmarked surface of the moon and leaving their boot prints in the lunar dust, which Armstrong likened to a fine powdered charcoal. As part of their moonwalk, the astronauts erected a U.S. flag on lunar soil, thereby laying claim to the celestial body amid an ongoing space race between the Earth's two largest nuclear powers. As Sánchez and other Cuban exiles were arriving in the United States during the 60s, the topic of space-age travel was constantly in the news and on people's minds. In 1966 and 1968, NASA released two spectacular photographs that showed not just the moon, but the Earth appearing as a luminous orb over the lunar horizon line. Viewers were able to see these two cosmic bodies from a new perspective, at once topographically distinct, yet wholly interconnected in their shared existence. As the New York artist Linda Benglis would say, with regard to her 1969 latex floor painting, Planet, these perspectives of the Earth suggested a new way of perceiving matter, a kind of phenomenological, otherworldly viewing of looking back on our bodies and ourselves in the world. This was also the period when Sánchez began making some of her earliest topologies, which in their very nature posed an encounter between two corporeal bodies in space. Her practice would soon take shape conceptually and formally through the language of the space age, just as many other visual artists were turning their gaze to the moon and to outer space as well. Sánchez was edging towards more crystalline, lunar forms in her abstract paintings by the end of the decade, as evident in this cosmic-inspired canvas in which she blended her informalist techniques with the linear and topological styles that she was now beginning to favor. In this untitled artwork, Sánchez juxtaposes a black, textured ground of voluminous geometric shapes, resembling in part a planetary body and a ring in outer space, with a flat, pale, and pristine semicircle, onto whose gleaming surface she drew the thin curves of a suspended crescent moon. Although fashioned at the height of modern lunar exploration, Sánchez's artwork does not seek to replicate or allude to the period's famous images of the moon, such as its dusty, cratered surface that another artist, Vija Salmons, concurrently took up in her painstakingly precise drawings of the subject. Instead, Sánchez's lunar forms, pictured in a neutral palette against the dark void of the universe, are crisply rendered, silky smooth, and sublime. They convey a sense of clarity and balance, of nature reduced to its bare, essential state. Her painting was approximating a new lunar subject in her practice, one that resonated with the feminist utopian writings of Cuban émigré Dolores Prida. Prida, who moved with her family from Cuba to New York in 1961, entered Sanchez's artistic and social circles in the late 60s. Her poetry of this period was connected to themes of female sisterhood, wartime violence and victimization, and yearnings for cosmic unity. All were timely topics informed by the ongoing Vietnam War, the burgeoning US feminist movement, and the massive social upheaval and political protests that were encircling the globe. In her 1971 chapbook, Women of the Hour, Cosmic Feminist Poetry, Prida issued a rallying cry to the world's women to liberate themselves from earthly bloodshed and violence, and to sing together till the shattering of the skies. Matching the piercing quality of the poem was Sanchez's linear print that appeared on the chapbook's cover. Here, the artist's smooth and polished lines, printed in a vibrant feminine red, spin across the page beneath a bold red sky. They capture a clarifying shift in tone and outlook that was pervasive in both Sanchez's artwork, especially her emerging topologies, and Prida's writing. Transcending the earlier existential poetics in which a migrant despairs at the loss of one's homeland, the cosmic poetics now proposed by Sánchez and Prida represented a clearer, more extroverted search for social bonding, female connectivity, and harmony with nature and the universe. It was as though their Cuban exile, uncertain at first but becoming more definitive over the course of the 60s, led them to a more liberating visual and written aesthetics that were grounded in a language of sensual communication and belonging. In the October 1970 issue of La Nueva Sangre, Prida published an essay entitled El erotismo espacial en la pintura de Zilia Sánchez, or Spatial Eroticism in Zilia Sánchez's painting. Her text was accompanied by a photo of a single breast-like panel from Sanchez's polyptych Eros y la Comunicación Sublimada número 1, a work that is now known as Troyanas, and we see part of Troyanas on the wall over here. Employing the word espacial, or spatial, in her title, Prida was referring not only to the three-dimensionality of Sanchez's new artwork, but also to the cosmic and celestial qualities of it. Indeed, before Sánchez had even embarked on her Lunar series, both Prida and Mario Peña, a Cuban theater colleague in New York, were commenting on the cosmic nature of the artist's pristine topologies, which were initially painted in white, black, or gray. Included in their discussion was Sanchez's sequence of 4 all-white rectangular panels entitled Secuencia C número 8. Grouped together in pairs, the panel's circular projections appeared both breast-like and celestial in nature, with a fall of ambient light forging a darkened, vulva-like cratered opening between the circles. In Prida's 1970 essay, which she wrote in the wake of Apollo 11's lunar landing, Prida compares a viewer's physical encounter with Sanchez's topologies to an erotic lunar exploration in space. The artist's canvases, she argues, lure the viewer into their rhythmic gravitational field, compelling the body of the spectator to orbit around the artwork's voluminous corporeality. She writes, quote, "Like astronauts, we move in outer space. There is a challenge or a dare in Sanchez's silent lunar forms, in the gray-white ripples caressing a woman's body. There is a challenge, and the challenge is visual and sexual," end quote. Prida's eroticized analogy of an astronaut approaching a lunar form would have called to mind NASA's contemporary photos of a voluptuous moon floating solitary in space. However, unlike the US astronauts who symbolically laid claim to the Earth's moon, Sanchez's topological viewer encounters a different kind of lunar body in space. According to Prida, it is a female body that reaches out to the viewer, ready to extend its hands and touch us. She writes, "We are offered and invited to establish a total communication, to bring that relation to its ultimate physical consequences." Here, rather than presenting the moon as a passive, inert object awaiting penetration by an American flag, Prida frames Sanchez's topologies as sentient lunar beings that generate a spatial eroticism and engagement with the viewer. She rapturously describes this exchange in orgasmic terms, writing, "Here, white on white breasts, time and space, movement of hips, and the silent slip of a hand. Here, white and white-black gray, a tremor of pores. Here, the traces of the first lunar intercourse." Such a coupling constitutes a feminist and even queer re-envisioning of the lunar landing that is predicated on mutual sensual discovery rather than on the unilateral conquest of man over nature. It also prefigures the thematic coupling in Sanchez's Lunares of the female body and the moon, likely helping to sow the idea as Sánchez expanded her topological practice. Thus, for Prida and Sánchez, the cosmos in the late 1960s represented a place for intimacy and connection. It functioned as a projective and receptive space for the female exilic body, a kind of utopian environment where one could presumably escape the stresses and displacements of life on Earth, including the sexual constraints imposed on women and same-sex couples. For Prida, Sánchez's cosmic bodies in their outward reach were expressing individual autonomy and corporeal desires. The personal intimacies destroyed by the Cuban Revolution, as vividly pictured in Cortázar's and Rivero's earlier poetry, were now being rehabilitated through new cosmic metaphors and conceptual frameworks. Among them, Prida's suggestion of a lunar coupling in Sánchez's art would acquire a more profound personal meaning amid the artist's Caribbean homecoming in 1971, citing the female body in and as nature. In relocating to San Juan, Puerto Rico, Sánchez was rekindling her connection to nature, to the tropical sunlight, the sea, and the unobscured moon overhead. Sánchez recalls that when she was a child in Havana, her mother used to sing her a song about the moon and take her outdoors at night whenever she was crying or having trouble sleeping. The moonlight, she says, was the only thing that consoled her in times of despair. Shortly after arriving in Puerto Rico, Sánchez began folding the abstract curves of the female body, such as breasts, hips, and vulva, into the rounded contours of the moon, at once locating the corporeal in and as the cosmos. Her occasional use of a light pink and white palette underscored the feminine essence of this union and of the moon, which throughout history has been linked linguistically, conceptually, and biologically to the female sex. Differing from her previous topologies, Sánchez's lunares would function as sites for locating the self in the world, a connection that she emphasized by extricating many of these topologies from the wall and displaying some of them temporarily or permanently in the space of nature. A concurrent practice by another Cuban artist in exile who was citing the female body in nature are the earth body works of Ana Mendieta, specifically her siluetas, which she created in Iowa and Mexico between 1973 and 1980. By positioning her own nude body in the landscape or by tracing the outline of her body in the earth, Mendieta formed various silhouettes by using organic materials such as blood, rocks, soil, sand, twigs, and flowers. In a color slide from 1980, the imprint of Mendieta's body appears in the sand of La Ventosa Beach, its dark, vaginal-like cavity encircled by red pigment resembling menstrual blood. Akin to Sánchez's lunar dos displayed on the shoreline, Mendieta's silhouette locates the female anatomy and its processes within the cycles of the Earth's tides and moon. Mendieta's earth body works were grounded in both the personal trauma of her separation from Cuba and her unyielding search for unity and belonging in the world. She would later expand on these sentiments in her Esculturas Rupestres, or Rupestrian Sculptures, a series that was prompted by the artist's return trips to Cuba in the early 1980s. And here I should pause and say that Dr. Cristina Leon has written an excellent chapter in her book on this very series. Carving directly into the limestone walls of Jaruco National Park, Mendieta produced a series of rock carvings of archetypal female forms of breasts, vulva, and womb that she named after pre-Columbian goddesses from the local Taíno culture. Mendieta's impulse to embed these sculptures in her motherland, which she described as a loving return to the maternal breasts, resonates with Sánchez embarking on her lunares after returning to the Caribbean and reconnecting with the moonlight that had calmed her as a child. This, too, Sánchez associated with the maternal presence, that of her mother. For both Mendieta and Sánchez, their embodied experiences of reuniting with Cuban or Caribbean landscapes after more than a decade in exile led to an expansion of their practices into more elemental, even ancestral realms, in which they merged their signature female forms with the environments that they had physically and emotionally been torn from. Final section is called Lunar Tattoos. In the late 1980s or 1990s, Sánchez began drawing on the surface of several of her pre-existing lunares, essentially transforming the work's spare minimalist appearance while keeping their original volumes intact. Closing her eyes and moving her hand in a rhythmic, arcing motion, she created crescent and full moon shapes, abstract geometries, and figurative drawings that referred to her own personal memories and peregrinations. Like the physical markings on a body, these drawings she referred to as tatuajes, or tattoos, linking them conceptually to the meaning of the Spanish word lunar. A lunar, she reminds us, refers not only to the moon, but also to a mole or birthmark on the skin. It is a permanent marking, sometimes rounded in the shape of a moon, that can appear at birth or develop as one grows older. It is nature's drawing on the body, she explains, and similar to a tattoo, it contains remembrances of the past. Approaching her topology surface as a skin, Sánchez inscribed her own exilic body in the cosmos, thus transforming her topological art into repositories of personal nostalgia and sites of belonging. In 1996, for example, Sánchez executed one of her largest, most complex tattoos on the exterior of Lunar 10, a 23-year-old diptych that had remained in her possession since its creation. To the work's unadorned white and pink surface, Sánchez added a circular pool of light blue paint, evoking the Caribbean sea and sky, and proceeded to draw a sprawling tattoo that covered nearly the entire diptych. And here the work is over here before us. Several years later, in a filmed encounter between the artist and her artwork, Sánchez would indicate that Lunar 10, now retitled Lunar con Tatuaje, had accumulated new layers over time. These markings and their meanings, seemingly indecipherable to anyone but Sánchez, she discussed at length in an unfinished video project by one of her childhood friends, the Cuban filmmaker Enrique Pineda Barnett. In Pineda Barnett's video from 2009, we observe Sánchez approaching Lunar con Tatuaje and tracing with her finger the work's tattoo. Gesturing first to the left side to an abstract drawing of Cuba seen from an aerial perspective, Sánchez then sweeps her hand over the diptych from left to right, up and down, almost as if reading the pages of a book, while narrating the memories and experiences associated with these graphic marks. To the lower right of Cuba's outline, for instance, she locates a miniature figure holding flags in both hands, representing a ground controller at Havana's airport as she embarked on a late 1950s European sojourn. She then follows the tattoo's lines from Cuba, marking her plane's path, to a tiny cross symbolizing her arrival in Spain, where she recalls being greeted uneasily by her highly religious and conservative aunts. Next, Sánchez traces a series of broken lines and dots southward, signs of confusion, she says, to the city of Paris, which is indicated by a full circle or moon and several interconnected semi-elliptical curves or half-moons. She recalls the nights of a half-moon being very beautiful during the evening she spent in Paris with her close friend, the Cuban writer Severo Sarduy, whom she occasionally visited there in the 1960s. On the right panel, tracing a profusion of arcs and crescent moon strokes, Sánchez points to a drawing of an unblinking eye, her mother's eye, that she imagines watching her from Cuba as she traveled and wrote letters home. Paired on the adjoining left panel is an outstretched hand belonging to her young nephew, which, along with her mother's eye, represent forms of corporeal familial intimacy, of bodies sensing, watching, and reaching for one another across spatial and geographical divides. To the right of her mother's eye, Sánchez points to a small, blocky edifice symbolizing New York, which she first visited briefly on her return trip from Europe to Cuba in the late 1950s. Finally, Sánchez gestures affectionately to a drawing of a modest house, her grandmother's house in Cojimar, Cuba, pictured in the lower right quadrant of her topology. She then points above this to the upper right quadrant, where a less recognizable and rotated outline of the island of Cuba appears. It becomes clear that Sánchez's abstract marks and figurative drawings constitute a personal cartography of key recollections and places that the artist traversed in the late 1950s and 1960s. Included are references to her travels in Spain, France, and New York, all of which appear bookended by two disparate aerial views of Cuba. The Cuba on the left, from which she departed in the late 50s, is a more identifiable, traditional outline of her homeland that includes beneath it the small island formerly known as Isla de Pinos. The Cuba on the right, meanwhile, appears to have been abstracted and rotated on its axis, and it does not readily look like the figure pictured on a map. Although Sánchez does not explain these differences in the video, it seems plausible that, when following her narrative from the left to the right, the Cuba at the end is the one that she could never fully return to after going into exile. Its image, inverted through memory, registers as an unwelcoming and unknowable place. This she juxtaposes with the familiar frontal depiction of her grandmother's house, which, as Sánchez has stated elsewhere, is a space that lives in her memory and is repeated physically in the form of her San Juan studio, which similarly resides in a small house. Sánchez's tattoo, in other words, represents more than just a series of marks on a topological body. It insinuates the marks created by her body and her mind as she experienced the world and reminisces about the past. Her drawing also contains two universal signs of the self, which are imprinted by the artist in sign language and flag semaphore. The hand gesture for the letter I appears near the bottom of the diptych next to the abundant moons that represent her time in Paris, while another marker for the letter I is indicated by the ground controller's flags marking her departure from Cuba. These letters further reinforce Sanchez's presence in this cartographic tattoo and speak to the increasingly evident personalization of her lunares as they signify not just any body, but Sanchez's own body, inscribed in the larger cosmos. Sanchez's practice of tattooing her topologies was again shaped by her close literary friendships, in this case with Severo Sarduy, whose 1969 book of essays, Escrito sobre un cuerpo, or Written on a Body, she credits with giving her the idea to begin writing on her lunares. According to Sarduy, the act of inscribing a surface, whether it be a canvas, a page, or a body, is a form of tattooing it and encoding it with signs so that an amorphous mass becomes words to communicate. For Sánchez, her drawing on the surface of her topologies was done intuitively and intimately, rendering a cartography that was guided not by scientific instruments or measurements, but by, in her words, moving my arm in a circle, with that rhythm of the circle that is also an expression of the shape of the moon. Her tattoos transformed her topologies from unblemished erotic bodies into cryptic repositories of personal nostalgia, remembrance, and memorialization. By the time that Sánchez tattooed Lunar Diez, many of the people and places she referenced, including Sarduy, who had passed away from AIDS in 1993, were present only in memory. Her tattoos, therefore, are not altogether different from the meanings of ordinary tattoos applied to a person's body. They're commemorations and declarations of one's identity, community, and existence in the world. Superimposed on her lunares, Sanchez's inscriptions signal a recuperation of the artist's origins and an assertion of her identity across time and space. Moreover, they turn her topology surfaces into texts that further exemplify the impact of Sanchez's literary circles on her practice well into the late 20th century. Thank you.